The Arizona sun in 1875 was not merely a celestial body, but a physical weight, pressing down with tyrannical force upon the makeshift auction yard on the outskirts of Prescott, baking the wooden platform until the air shimmered with heat haze and the scent of dry pine. James Blackwood stood at the periphery of the gathering crowd, a man of 52 years who wore his history in the deep fissures of his weathered face and the calloused texture of hands that had known both the plow and the rifle. He possessed the quiet, terrifying stillness of a man who had been hollowed out by grief, leaving only a husk that moved through the motions of existence without truly participating in them. The town itself was a frontier settlement still struggling to find its identity a decade after the Civil War. A place where dust devils danced between the boots of miners, ranchers, and opportunists who had drifted west in search of gold or oblivion. James had come only for supplies, flour, coffee, and nails for a homestead that was slowly falling into disrepair, but the hushed electric murmurs rippling through the general store had drawn him here against his better judgment. Men spoke in low, conspiratorial tones about Silas Crane, a bottom-feeding trader known for dealing in human misery, and his latest acquisition, an Apache woman of unusual ferocity. Now, standing amidst the smell of unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, and horse manure, James adjusted the brim of his hat against the glare, his thumb absently brushing the ivory grip of the Colt Navy 1851 at his hip. It was a relic of his days as a Union captain, much like James himself, a remnant of a war that had supposedly ended but continued to bleed into the soil of the territory. He watched as the mundane conversations about cattle prices and the weather died a sudden death when Crane, sweating and theatrical, ascended the creaking platform to announce a rare opportunity, signaling the beginning of an event that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of James's lingering life. The atmosphere in the yard shifted from idle curiosity to a palpable heavy tension as two burly handlers dragged the woman onto the stage, her resistance evident in the way she dug her heels into the wood and held her chin high, despite the heavy iron chains that bound her wrists and ankles. She was a striking, jarring presence against the drab backdrop of dusty men. Her black hair was matted but braided with beads and feathers that spoke of a culture the crowd feared, and her deerskin dress was torn from the violence of her capture. However, it was her face that commanded James's reluctant attention, painted with stark red symbols across her forehead, cheek, and jaw, marking her not merely as a woman of the tribe, but as a warrior. Her eyes, dark and burning with an intelligence that refused to be extinguished by her shackles, swept over the crowd not with the fear of a victim, but with the cold, assessing gaze of a predator cataloguing threats. When those eyes briefly locked with James's, he felt a sudden physical jolt in his chest. A sensation of recognition that had nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with shared trauma. He saw in her the same hollowed-out fury that he carried in his own heart. Crane began his vile sales pitch, speaking of her as if she were livestock, touting her strength and health while warning of her wild streak, recounting with a grin how she had maimed 2 of his men during transport. The crowd muttered, unsettled by the fierce defiance radiating from her, and when Crane opened the bidding at $5, the silence was deafening. It wasn't just the price, it was the woman herself. She looked less like a servant and more like a stick of dynamite waiting for a match. When the price dropped to $3, desperation creeping into Crane's voice, the woman spoke. Her voice cut through the stagnant heat, clear and unaccented. "I would rather die than be owned by any man here." The perfect English stunned the onlookers, freezing the jeers in their throats, for it transformed her from a savage caricature into a human being of undeniable intellect and will. In that frozen moment, James felt the stirrings of a purpose he thought had been buried 8 months ago, alongside his daughter, Elizabeth. The town knew James as a man of few words and reliable judgment, a skilled tracker who disappeared into the wilderness for weeks, but they did not speak of the ghost he carried. Elizabeth had been 16, a girl who believed that books could bridge the chasm between cultures, a belief that had led her to volunteer at a missionary outpost teaching Apache children to read. She had died clutching a primer to her chest during a border skirmish, killed not by the arrow the official report claimed, but by a panicked soldier's bullet, a truth James had deduced from the wound but could never prove. Now, watching this Apache woman standing proud in her chains, echoing the very humanity Elizabeth had tried to nurture, James made a choice. It was not a choice born of strategy, but of a moral imperative that suddenly outweighed his apathy. $3, he announced, his voice gravelly and carrying effortlessly across the yard. The crowd parted as he stepped forward, pulling 3 worn bills from his pocket. Crane, relieved to salvage any profit, snatched the money and declared her sold. James ascended the platform, ignoring the whispers of traitor and fool, and stopped a respectful distance from the woman whose name Crane had butchered as Nara. He produced the key Crane had reluctantly surrendered and spoke to her, not as a master to a slave, but as one soldier to another. "I'm going to remove these," he said quietly, unlocking the manacles despite the warnings from the crowd that she would slit his throat. When the chains fell with a heavy clank, she rubbed her raw wrists and asked what game he was playing. "No game," James replied, looking her in the eye. "I have a horse, there is water and food. You are welcome to whatever you need." He turned his back on her, the ultimate sign of trust, or perhaps indifference to death, and walked toward his mare, leaving her to decide whether to kill him, flee, or follow. The journey out of Prescott was a gauntlet of hostile stares, the grieving rancher and the Apache warrior walking side by side in a silence thick with unasked questions. They traveled 5 miles until the town was swallowed by the horizon, and the moment they crossed a ridgeline, Nara made her move. She bolted, not attacking him, but sprinting into the unforgiving scrubland with a desperate, frantic energy. James did not chase her. He simply mounted his mare and followed at a distance, tracking her through the heat. He knew the desert. He knew that without water, her defiance would end in death before sunset. It took an hour for the heat to claim her. She slowed, stumbled, and finally collapsed in the dust, her body betraying her will. James approached slowly, dismounting and placing his canteen on the ground between them. "The nearest water is 10 miles south," he said, his voice devoid of judgment. "Or we can continue west to a trading post run by Margaret Wilson. She helps people. I can take you there, and then we go our separate ways." Nara looked at him, sweat streaking the warrior paint on her face, and demanded to know why he hadn't let her die. James looked at the horizon, seeing things she couldn't. "Because no human being should be in chains," he said, and then added the darker truth, "and because I've been fighting my own battles since my daughter died." It was this admission, the crack in his armor, that made her drink. She accepted the water and the temporary alliance, agreeing to the trading post but refusing to ride behind him, choosing instead to walk beside the horse. They moved as equals now, bound not by ownership but by a fragile, unspoken agreement to survive the desert and the demons pursuing them both. As dusk bled the sky purple and the temperature plummeted, they made camp in the shelter of a rock formation. The intimacy of the small fire stripped away the pretenses of the day. They ate jerky and dried fruit in silence until James asked about the marks on her face. Nara traced them with a finger, explaining they represented her dead brother, the children she protected, and the person she would become if she survived. "Children of my tribe," she clarified, "orphans I gather and teach." The parallel to Elizabeth was a physical blow to James, robbing him of breath. He confessed the truth of his daughter's death then, how she had been teaching reading, how she was caught in the crossfire, and how he knew it was a soldier's bullet, specifically a soldier under the command of Colonel Maxwell Hammond. "Vengeance won't bring her back," James said, staring into the flames, "but saving someone else might." Nara absorbed this, her hostility softening into a guarded curiosity. She revealed her own secret then. The children were not just an abstract concept. There were 14 of them, hidden in caves in the Sierra Ancha Mountains, alone and running out of food. She had allowed herself to be captured to lead the patrols away from them. "They have food for perhaps another week," she said, her voice tight with suppressed panic. "After that, they starve." James realized with a sinking heart that the trading post was the wrong direction. Saving these children would mean riding north, back into the teeth of the military patrols, and directly challenging the man responsible for his daughter's death. Before James could verbalize the shift in their plans, the stillness of the desert night was shattered by the metallic click of a rifle hammer. He reached for his weapon, but it was too late. 3 figures emerged from the shadows, stepping into the circle of firelight with weapons drawn. At their center stood Colonel Maxwell Hammond, a man who wore his authority like a second skin, his grey moustache trimmed with precision, his eyes cold and predatory. "James Blackwood," Hammond sneered, his gaze flicking between the rancher and the Apache woman. "I heard rumors you'd gone native. I didn't think you'd sunk this low." Hammond was flanked by two younger soldiers, their nervousness betraying their inexperience, but their rifles were steady enough. He accused James of harboring a dangerous fugitive, a woman who had killed his men and incited rebellion. James stood slowly, placing himself subtly between Hammond and Nara. "I bought her at auction," James said evenly. "She is under my protection." Hammond laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Protection? Like you protected your daughter?" The words were a calculated cruelty, designed to unbalance James, to provoke a reaction that would justify a shooting. "This isn't about Elizabeth," James lied, his voice dropping an octave. "It's about the law." Hammond stepped closer, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows across his face. "This is about justice, Blackwood. Justice for the territory. That woman hangs, and if you stand in the way, you'll be buried right beside her." The standoff hung on a razor's edge, the silence filled only by the crackle of the fire and the heavy, terrifying realization that the war James thought he had left behind had just found him again. The tension in the firelight snapped not with a whimper but with a violent explosion of sparks as Nara, moving with the coiled speed of a rattlesnake, lunged for the campfire. She seized a burning branch of mesquite, the wood hissing with resin, and swung it in a wide, savage arc that caught the nearest soldier across the face, sending him reeling backward with a howl of surprised agony that shattered the desert silence. In that chaotic nanosecond of distraction, James abandoned diplomacy for survival. He rolled to his right, diving for the Winchester rifle he had strategically placed just beyond the circle of light. His shoulder hit the hard-packed earth, but his hands found the cold steel of the barrel, and he came up on one knee, the lever action racking around into the chamber with a mechanical clack that sounded louder than thunder. He did not aim at Hammond. Killing a colonel would bring the entire might of the US cavalry down upon them like a hammer, but instead fired a single deafening shot into the dirt mere inches from Hammond's polished boots. "Tell your men to stand down, Colonel," James commanded, his voice devoid of fear, vibrating with the deadly calm of a man who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death so many times he knew the terrain by heart. Hammond flinched, the muzzle flash illuminating the rage contorting his features, but he saw the unblinking resolve in James's eyes and the burning brand still held in Nara's hand. For a breathless eternity, the only sound was the soldier groaning on the ground and the crackle of the fire. Then, with a sneer that promised future retribution, Hammond signaled a retreat, vanishing into the darkness with a vow that the territory wasn't big enough to hide them. James wasted no time in self-congratulation. He knew that Hammond's retreat was merely a tactical withdrawal to gather reinforcements, and the silence that followed was not safety, but the breath before the scream. He and Nara broke camp with frantic efficiency, kicking dirt over the fire to douse the light and mounting the mare to ride double, pushing north toward the Sierra Ancha Mountains under the pale, indifferent light of a quarter moon. The journey was a grueling test of endurance that stretched through the remainder of the night and into the bleeding grey of dawn, the terrain shifting from the flat, open desert to a jagged landscape of scrub oak and treacherous ravines that clawed at the horse's legs. James walked for long stretches to spare the mare, his boots grinding against loose shale, every step sending a jolt of pain through a blister forming on his left heel, a minor injury that throbbed with the insistent rhythm of a heartbeat. They spoke little, conserving breath for the climb, but the shared danger had forged a silent communication between them. Nara navigated by the stars and the silhouette of the ridges, while James watched their back trail, his eyes scanning the horizon for the dust cloud that would herald Hammond's return. By mid-morning, the heat began to rise again, but the air here was thinner, sharper, carrying the scent of pine and impending rain. "He is herding us," James observed grimly, as they paused to water the horse at a trickle of a spring. "He knows we are heading for the mountains. He doesn't need to catch us yet. He's waiting for us to lead him to the children." Nara looked at him, her face streaked with dust and fatigue, and nodded slowly, acknowledging the cruel strategic truth that their survival was the very thing endangering those they sought to save. The weather turned on them in the afternoon, the heat breaking suddenly as bruised purple thunderheads boiled over the peaks of the Sierra Ancha, swallowing the sun and plunging the canyons into a premature twilight. The first drops of rain were fat and cold, hitting the dust like bullets, quickly escalating into a torrential downpour that transformed the dry creek beds into churning veins of mud and debris. Nara spotted a narrow opening in a limestone cliff face, a shallow cave obscured by a curtain of ironwood, and they scrambled inside just as the heavens opened up with apocalyptic fury. The shelter was cramped and smelled of damp earth and old animal droppings, but it was dry. James sank against the cave wall, finally allowing himself to wince as he pulled off his boot to inspect his foot. The blister had burst, leaving a raw, angry patch of flesh that was beginning to red with infection. Nara watched him, her expression unreadable, then moved to his side without a word. From a pouch at her waist, she produced a handful of dried yarrow leaves, chewing them into a pulp before kneeling at his feet. James hesitated, instinct warring with necessity, but he held still as she applied the green poultice to the wound. The sting was sharp, followed immediately by a numbing coolness. "We cannot afford for you to be lame," she said, her voice cutting through the sound of the rain. "The children need us both at full strength." It was an act of intimacy that transcended their cultural divide. The Apache warrior healing the white soldier, and in the dim light, James saw the scars on her own hands, a map of the violence she had endured to protect the lives entrusted to her. As the storm raged outside, sealing them in a grey world of water and stone, the barriers between them began to erode further, replaced by the somber camaraderie of the besieged. James asked about the children, needing to understand the magnitude of what they were walking toward, and Nara spoke of them not as a collective burden, but as individuals with fears and ghosts of their own. She told him of Dakota, the 12-year-old who carried the weight of a father, and of the twins who barely remembered the parents they had lost to the reservation system. "They are the future," she said, her eyes reflecting the grey light from the cave mouth. "If they are taken, if they are forced to forget who they are, then my people truly die." James listened, the ache in his chest resonating with her words, for he heard the echo of Elizabeth's voice in Nara's defiance. He told her then of the library Elizabeth had wanted to build, of her belief that a person who could read was never truly powerless because their mind could travel where their body could not. "She sounds like a warrior," Nara noted softly, a compliment of the highest order. "She was," James replied, his voice thick with the grief he usually kept locked away. "She fought with books instead of arrows, but she was killed just the same." The rain began to slacken, leaving the world outside washed clean and dangerously quiet, and James knew the reprieve was over. They were two broken people trying to save broken children, bound together by the ghosts of those they had failed to save in the past. Leaving the cave, they encountered the reality of Hammond's tightening noose sooner than expected. Barely an hour after resuming their trek, they were forced to dive into a thicket of manzanita as a cavalry patrol rode past on the trail below. It was Sergeant Ellis, a hard-eyed man James knew from the war, leading 6 troopers who scanned the ridges with bored efficiency. Lying flat in the mud, James felt Nara tense like a coiled spring beside him, her hand gripping a stone as if she intended to take on 6 armed men with a rock. He placed a restraining hand on her arm, feeling the tremors of adrenaline coursing through her. They lay frozen as the soldiers stopped to water their horses mere yards away, their conversation drifting up on the wind. "Hammond says burn them out if we have to," one soldier muttered, spitting tobacco juice into the mud. "Says the girl killed Jenkins. No mercy for child killers." The irony was so bitter it tasted like bile in James's throat. Hammond had twisted the narrative so thoroughly that these men believed they were the agents of justice. When the patrol finally moved on, heading toward the main pass, Nara led James away from the trail, guiding him toward a sheer rock face that looked impassable to his eyes. "My brother's path," she whispered. "The soldiers do not know it. It is steep and dangerous, but it is the only way left." They began the ascent as the sun dipped below the peaks, the rock cooling rapidly under their fingers, the path nothing more than a series of precarious ledges hanging over a drop that promised oblivion. Night had fully claimed the mountains by the time they reached the upper elevations, the stars hanging like diamonds in the thin, cold air. They were exhausted, their muscles trembling with effort, when Nara suddenly stopped and issued a soft, trilling bird call that sounded like a quail, but carried a rhythmic cadence no bird possessed. Silence answered her for a long, terrifying minute, stretching until James began to fear the worst, that the children had already been found or had fled. Then a shadow detached itself from the rocks above them, silhouetted against the Milky Way. It was a boy, lithe and wary, holding a crude bow with an arrow nocked. "Dakota," Nara breathed, the relief in her voice cracking her composure. The boy scrambled down the rocks with the agility of a mountain goat, his eyes darting instantly to James, narrowing with immediate lethal suspicion at the sight of the white man and the remnants of his military bearing. He spoke sharply to Nara in Apache, gesturing accusingly at James, his body interposed between the stranger and the hidden path upward. Nara spoke rapidly, her tone soothing but authoritative, explaining the debt they owed James, the medicine he carried, and the help he offered. Dakota listened, his gaze never leaving James's face, searching for the deceit he had learned to expect from men in uniforms. Finally, James stepped forward, hands open and empty. "I am not a soldier anymore, son," he said softly. "I am just a man who made a promise to Nara." Dakota studied him for a heartbeat longer, then nodded once, a sharp, military jerk of the chin. "Come," he said in halted English. "Nima is bad, very bad." The final leg of the journey was a nightmare of claustrophobia and vertigo. Dakota led them through a fissure in the cliff face so narrow that James had to exhale fully to squeeze his chest through, the rock scraping buttons from his shirt. The passage opened into a rising tunnel that wound through the heart of the mountain, pitch black and smelling of ancient dust, before finally emerging into a large natural cavern illuminated by the embers of a dying fire. The sight that greeted James stopped him cold. 13 children, ranging from toddlers to adolescents, were huddled together in the gloom, their eyes wide ovals of fear in gaunt faces. The cave was a desperate sanctuary, filled with the meager debris of survival. Woven mats, dried herbs hanging from stalactites, and a small pile of bones from small game. Dakota moved immediately to a pile of furs in the corner where a small girl lay thrashing in the grip of a fever dream. This was Nima. James knelt beside her, his medical instincts kicking in as he listened to the wet, rattling wheeze of her breathing. It was pneumonia, advanced and aggressive. Her skin was burning to the touch, and her lips were tinged with a terrifying shade of blue. "The medicine," Nara demanded, her voice tight. James reached for his saddlebags, which he had carried through the squeeze, but as he fumbled for the quinine, he did a quick head count of the children watching him. 13. Nara had said 14. He looked up, his eyes meeting Nara's, and saw the sudden, horrific realization dawn on her face as she scanned the group. "Where is Kai?" she asked Dakota, her voice trembling. The boy looked down, shame warring with exhaustion in his expression. "He went for water," Dakota whispered, pointing toward the back of the cave where a draft of air hinted at another exit. "Yesterday, he did not come back." The silence that followed was heavier than the stone above them. They had arrived with medicine for the sick, only to find they were already losing the war against the mountain. The revelation that 5-year-old Kai was missing sucked the oxygen out of the cavern, leaving the air thick with a panic that was all the more terrifying for its silence. James saw the fracture in Nara's composure, the way her hand tightened around Nima's feverish form until her knuckles turned white. A mother, in spirit if not in blood, faced with the impossible choice between the dying child in her arms and the lost one in the wilderness. James made the decision for her, his voice cutting through the despair with the flat authority of command. "I will find him," he stated, checking the load in his revolver. "You stay with Nima. She cannot move, and if the fever spikes, she needs you." But they had a logistical nightmare. The medicine was still in the saddlebags on James's mare, tethered a mile down the mountain in a box canyon, and Nima's rattling breath suggested she didn't have hours to spare. Dakota stepped forward, his young face set in a grim line that aged him a decade. "I know the way down," the boy insisted. "Faster than you. I will get the medicine." It was a gamble that twisted James's gut, sending a 12-year-old boy past military patrols. But they were out of safe options. He placed a heavy hand on Dakota's shoulder, looking him in the eye. "Speed is life, son. Don't fight. Don't engage. If you see soldiers, you hide. The medicine is useless if you don't come back." Dakota nodded, grabbed a water skin, and vanished into the shadowed tunnel, leaving James to head toward the secondary exit, a fissure that opened onto the western slope near the spring where Kai had last been seen. Emerging from the cave system was like stepping into an oven. The storm had passed, leaving the air scoured clean and the sun hammering down on the wet rocks with renewed vengeance. James moved with the deliberate slowness of a hunter, placing his boots carefully to avoid sending loose scree clattering down the slope. The terrain here was a chaotic jumble of limestone boulders and twisted juniper, offering 1,000 hiding places but zero visibility. As he neared the spring, a meager seep of water bleeding from a crack in the granite, he froze. The wind carried a sound that stopped his heart. Voices. Not the chirping of birds or the rustle of wind, but the low, clipped baritone of English. James dropped into a crouch behind a boulder, peering through the scrub brush. Below him, on the ridgeline, he saw them. Colonel Hammond, mounted on a bay gelding, flanked by 6 troopers and a tracker who was pointing toward the cliffs. The noose wasn't just tightening, it was already around their necks. Hammond wasn't searching randomly, he had a grid. James realized with a sickening jolt that Kai wasn't just lost. He was trapped in the middle of a military sweep. If the boy made a sound, if he broke cover, he would be spotted instantly. Moving with agonizing care, James crept toward the water source, scanning the mud. He found it, a small, distinct footprint, half washed away by the rain, leading not back to the caves but up toward a narrow vertical fissure in the rock face, a desperate bolt hole for a frightened child. James reached the fissure, a crack in the earth barely wide enough for a coyote, and whispered the boy's name into the darkness. "Kai, my name is James. Nara sent me." For a long, terrifying moment, there was only silence, and James feared the boy had succumbed to exposure or fallen deeper into the earth. Then a whimper echoed from the shadows. "Hurt!" a small voice breathed. "Leg stuck!" James felt a wave of relief crash against a wall of urgency. He couldn't enter the fissure. His shoulders were too broad. "Kai, listen to me," he whispered, his eyes darting back to the ridge where Hammond's men were dismounting. "You have to be brave. I need you to push. Push yourself toward the light." It took 5 minutes of coaxing, of whispered promises and gentle commands, before a small, dust-caked hand reached out of the dark. James grabbed it, pulling gently, and Kai emerged, his face a mask of terror and dirt, his right knee a bloody ruin of scraped skin. The boy was shaking violently, clearly in shock. James scooped him up, intending to run, but a shout from below froze him. "Movement! On the scree slope!" A trooper had spotted them. A rifle crack echoed across the canyon, the bullets spalling rock fragments a foot above James's head. They were pinned. The tactical situation had disintegrated instantly. James was caught in the open with a wounded child, cut off from the cave entrance by the angle of fire, while Hammond's men began to scramble up the slope, shouting coordinates. He needed a miracle, or the next best thing. Chaos. James scanned his immediate surroundings and saw a stand of dead pinyon pines, their needles brown and brittle, practically dripping with volatile resin, standing like kindling against the windward side of the ridge. It was a desperate, reckless gambit that could easily kill them all if the wind shifted, but James was out of choices. He set Kai down in the shelter of a rock. "Stay," he ordered. He sprinted to the dead trees, striking a lucifer match against his belt buckle and tossing it into the dry undergrowth. The resin caught with a roar, the flames leaping up the dead trees with terrifying speed, transforming the pines into 20-foot torches. Thick, black smoke billowed instantly, rolling down the slope toward the soldiers, obscuring their vision and creating a wall of heat and confusion. "Fire!" someone screamed from the patrol. "Pull back! The horses!" As the soldiers scrambled to control their mounting panic and their terrified mounts, James grabbed Kai and ran, using the curtain of smoke to mask his movement as he scrambled laterally across the cliff face, aiming not for the cave, but for the rendezvous point Dakota had mentioned, a dense thicket of scrub oak near the lower trail. James burst through the brush, lungs burning, Kai clutching his neck like a lifeline, to find a scene of organized pandemonium. Nara had not waited in the trap. Seeing the smoke and hearing the shots, she had evacuated the children through the third, smallest exit, dragging them through the brush away from the fire. They were huddled in a depression in the earth, Nima strapped to Nara's back with a woven shawl, the other children wide-eyed and silent. But Dakota was missing. "The medicine!" James gasped, handing Kai to one of the older girls. Nara shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "He has not returned." As if on cue, a second volley of gunfire erupted from the valley floor, distinct rhythmic pistol shots, not military rifles. James realized Dakota had made it to the horse but had been intercepted. "Take them up the ridge," James barked at Nara. "Go to the tree line. Do not stop." Before she could protest, he turned and ran back toward the sound of the guns, abandoning stealth for speed. He crested a small rise to see his mare rearing in the canyon below, Dakota clinging to the saddle horn while two troopers tried to box him in. James raised his Colt, exhaling half a breath, and fired 2 shots in rapid succession, not at the men, but at the ground beneath their horses' hooves. The cavalry mounts, already spooked by the smoke, bucked violently, throwing one rider and forcing the other to fight for control. In that window of confusion, Dakota kicked the mare into a gallop, breaking through the line and scrambling up the trail toward James, the saddlebags flapping wildly. The reunion was brief and frantic. James vaulted onto the back of the mare behind Dakota, grabbing the reins to steady the animal as they thundered up the slope to join Nara and the children. They didn't stop to celebrate. The fire James had set was now a raging barrier that would hold Hammond back for perhaps an hour, but eventually the colonel would circle around. They moved with a brutal, relentless pace, putting miles between themselves and the smoke column that stained the sky. The terrain was unforgiving, a landscape of jagged rock and cactus that tore at their clothes and bruised their feet. James walked to let the smallest children ride, carrying Nima for miles when Nara's strength failed, then switching off to carry Kai. They rationed the water Dakota had brought, mere sips for parched throats, and James administered the quinine to Nima while they walked, praying the dosage was enough. The sun began to dip, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red, casting long shadows that stretched like grasping fingers. The children were stumbling now, some weeping silently from exhaustion, but they kept moving, driven by the primal fear of the men hunting them. James looked at Dakota, seeing the boy's face gray with fatigue but his eyes alert, watching the back trail. The boy had crossed a threshold today. He had ridden into fire and come back a man. Night fell, bringing a merciless cold that seeped into their bones, but it also brought cover. They marched until the moon was high, finally collapsing in a dry wash miles from the nearest trail. But James allowed no fire, no warmth. They huddled together for body heat, a tangle of limbs and shared shivering. Nima's breathing had eased slightly, the rattle less pronounced, a small victory in a day of near disasters. James sat on the rim of the wash, his rifle across his knees, watching the horizon. He saw no campfires, no movement, but he knew Hammond was out there, relentless and humiliated. The colonel would not stop now. This had become personal. Just before dawn, James roused them. "One more push," he whispered, his voice raspy. "Turnbull's trading post is 10 miles west. We make it by noon, or we don't make it at all." The final march was a blur of delirium. Thirst became a physical weight, and hunger a sharp cramp in their bellies. But as they crested the final ridge, the land opened up, and there, shimmering in the heat haze of the valley floor, was the stockade fence of the trading post. It looked like salvation, it looked like safety. But as James squinted against the glare, he saw dust rising from the road leading to the gates, a column of riders arriving from the east. Hammond had anticipated them. He hadn't just chased them, he had outflanked them. They were walking toward a sanctuary that was rapidly becoming a trap. They walked into the open, 2 figures against an army, their approach so brazen that the sentries on the perimeter held their fire in sheer confusion. When they reached the gate, Colonel Hammond emerged from the main building, looking immaculate and smug, like a cat that had just cornered a particularly troublesome mouse. "I've been expecting you, Blackwood," Hammond drawled, his eyes flicking dismissively over Dakota. "I see you've brought a peace offering, though I'm disappointed the woman isn't with you." James held his ground, his posture rigid. "The woman is gone, Colonel, heading south to the border with the others. We're here to discuss terms for the boy." It was a lie built on a foundation of sand, but James delivered it with the conviction of a man who had nothing left to lose. Hammond sneered, signaling his men to seize them. There was no negotiation, only the rough handling of soldiers stripping James of his weapons and shoving him toward a storage room at the back of the post. As the door slammed shut, plunging him into darkness, James's last sight was Dakota being led away by a different group of soldiers, the boy's head held high, his eyes locked on James with a terrifying trust. 3 days passed in the suffocating gloom of the storeroom, a time measured only by the changing angle of the light slipping through the cracks in the walls and the arrival of trays of lukewarm food pushed through the door. James paced the small space like a caged wolf, his mind replaying every possible scenario, every way Dakota could break under questioning, every way Nara could be discovered on the ridge. On the morning of the 4th day, the lock rattled and the door swung open to reveal the blinding white light of day. Hammond stood there, but the smugness was gone, replaced by a tight, vibrating anger. "It seems your story holds water," Hammond spat, clearly loathing every word. "My scouts found tracks crossing the San Pedro River, a large group, heading for Mexico." James kept his face impassive, masking the surge of relief that nearly buckled his knees. Nara had not only escaped, she had laid false trails, or perhaps Hammond's men were seeing what they wanted to see to avoid further time in the harsh terrain. "Then the boy goes free," James said, his voice raspy from disuse. "That was the deal." Hammond's jaw worked, his face flushing a mottled red. "The boy is immaterial now. There has been a development." Before Hammond could elaborate, a shadow fell over him, and a man stepped into the doorway who commanded the space simply by existing. He wore a dusty canvas suit rather than dress blues, his beard forked and graying, but the stars on his shoulders were unmistakable. It was General George Crook, the commander of the Department of Arizona, a man known for riding mules rather than thoroughbreds, and for a pragmatic fairness that infuriated hardliners like Hammond. "General," James said, straightening to attention instinctively. Crook nodded, stepping past the fuming colonel. "Mr. Blackwood, I've received some interesting correspondence regarding Colonel Hammond's allocation of resources. Hunting orphaned children with a company of cavalry seems a poor use of taxpayer money." Behind Crook, Sam Turnbull appeared, sporting a heavy bandage on his head but grinning broadly. "I managed to get a telegram out before the colonel here smashed my telegraph key," Turnbull said with grim satisfaction. "The general was nearby." Crook fixed Hammond with a stare that could have frozen water in the desert. "I also have sworn testimony from a Miss Catherine McAllister about soldiers assaulting a prisoner. And," Crook paused, his voice dropping, "a confession." Crook signaled to the yard, and a young private, barely 20 years old and looking as if he hadn't slept in a week, shuffled into the room. He refused to look at Hammond, keeping his eyes fixed on his boots. "Tell him, son," Crook ordered gently. The boy looked up at James, tears tracking through the dust on his face. "It was me, sir," he whispered. "At the outpost. The girl. We were told it was a raid. I saw movement in the window. I was scared. I just fired. I didn't know." The confession hung in the air, sucking the oxygen out of the room. The official lie, the Apache arrow, shattered, leaving only the tragic, banal truth of a frightened boy and a tragic mistake. James looked at the private, seeing the crushing guilt that would haunt this boy for the rest of his life, and felt his own rage drain away, replaced by a profound, hollow exhaustion. He looked at Hammond, who was staring at the wall, his career incinerated. "Get him out of here," James said softly. "I don't want his life. It won't bring her back." Crook nodded, satisfied. "Colonel Hammond is relieved of command pending a court of inquiry, and you, Mr. Blackwood, are free to go." Charges dropped, but James didn't move. "And the children?" he asked. "They can't stay on the run." Crook pulled a folded document from his jacket. "I'm trying something new, a pilot program. Displaced Apache who have a sponsor, a guardian with property, may be permitted to settle on private land, provided they remain peaceful. You have land, Mr. Blackwood." James thought of the 160 acres of neglected soil, the empty house filled with ghosts. "I do," he said. "Then sign here," Crook said, offering a pen. "You become their legal guardian. They become your wards. It's a loop in the law, but it will hold." James signed the paper, the scratch of the pen louder than any gunshot. It was a binding of lives, a commitment heavier than any chain, but as he wrote his name, he felt the first true breath of air fill his lungs in 8 months. The reunion at the McAllister Ranch, where Nara had eventually retreated when James didn't return, was a chaotic, tear-filled collision of relief. When James rode into the yard with Dakota beside him and a wagon full of supplies courtesy of a guilty government, Nara stood on the porch, her hand over her mouth, looking at the legal papers he held up like a shield. "We're going home," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "All of us." The journey back to the homestead was slow, a procession of the wounded and the weary, but the air was different now. It didn't smell of fear, it smelled of pine and possibility. When they finally crested the hill overlooking his ranch, the house looked small and battered, its windows dark, but to James, it looked like a fortress. They set to work immediately, not as guests, but as a family forged in fire. The children, wary at first, slowly began to claim the space, their laughter chasing the silence out of the corners where grief had gathered dust. 15 years later, the Arizona Territory had changed, softened by the relentless march of civilization, but the Blackwood Ranch remained a world apart. It had grown into a sprawling, thriving community. The original cabin was now the heart of a cluster of buildings. A schoolhouse where Dakota, now a man of 27 with the quiet authority of a scholar, taught mathematics and history in both English and Apache. A clinic where Nima, having survived the fever to become a healer, blended traditional herbalism with the medicine she had learned from books. The fields were green with corn and alfalfa, worked by young men and women who walked with their heads high, unafraid. James, his hair now a shock of white, sat in his rocking chair on the porch, the wood groaning rhythmically as he watched the sunset bleed across the western sky. The ache in his joints was a constant companion now, a reminder of the miles walked and the cold nights endured, but it was a good pain, the pain of a life used up for something that mattered. Nara stepped out of the house carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. Time had etched lines around her eyes and silvered the braids at her temples, but her spine was as straight as the day she had stood on the auction block. She handed him a mug and sat on the railing, looking out over the valley where children, some Apache, some white, some mixed, were chasing a dog through the tall grass. "The new family arrives tomorrow," she said, her voice warm. "More mouths to feed." James smiled, sipping the coffee. "We'll build another room. We always do." They sat in companionable silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled with words, until Nara turned to him, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "I was thinking," she said, "about that day in Prescott. $3. You drove a hard bargain." James chuckled, the sound rumbling deep in his chest. "I've often thought it was the best investment I ever made." Nara reached out, covering his rough, weathered hand with hers. "You didn't buy me, James," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, fierce and tender. "You know that, don't you? Freedom cannot be bought. You just bought the key. We had to walk through the door ourselves." James looked at her, then at the schoolhouse where Elizabeth's books were now worn soft from hundreds of hands, realizing that his daughter's dream had not died in the desert. It had simply changed shape, growing wild and strong like the land itself. $3, James mused, looking at the vibrant life teeming on the land that had once been a graveyard of his hopes. "Freedom is the presence of choice," he said, echoing the lesson she had taught him years ago. "And look at the choices we made." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the ranch in a golden twilight, and James Blackwood finally closed his eyes, not in grief, but in peace, listening to the sound of the future laughing in the dark.